kind of turning on that, and this is going to kind of segue from that towards some topics that we'll consider in today's afternoon session. I wanted to just show some slides that I put together for a lecture a few years ago that examine the use of ideas from literary theory, literary analysis to look at ceramic pieces. And it's an attempt to kind of get just a new language around really talking about the form of pots. And in pottery, we often talk about form as opposed to surface, where form kind of means what's the volumetric form and shape of a pot, and surface, as we've talked about in the early weeks of this class, are about how do you finish the surface. But here in this more philosophical context, when I say form really is meant to refer to all of the details of the physical material presence of the piece, what shape it is, what the surface looks like, all of those things are really meant to be grouped in there. And so the idea of trying to borrow language or analytic tools from literary theory is to focus on the idea of a trope. And so especially in the analysis of things like fiction or poetry, people analyzing poetry, for example, will often make a distinction between the plain meaning of the words in a poem and the sort of imagistic connotation that those words carry with them. And when we talk about a trope, that can generally refer to fancy tools that we have for trying to have the plain meaning of the words and their imagistic connotation sort of play with each other. And rather than going too much into the definition, I think it'll be easier just to show some examples because most of them will be already familiar to you. But let me just introduce the idea that when we're talking about pots, meaning especially functional ceramics, like cups and vases and mugs, there's an interesting parallel to that where something like a mug or a bottle, right, it has a kind of plain meaning, right? So a vessel has a form by which you might be able to identify it as a pitcher or a platter or whatever. It has the function that it's supposed to serve. It has the actual material that it's made of. But then at the same time, it has this metaphoric kind of level of presence where aspects of that piece may remind you of certain things and then call to mind, they may invoke certain kinds of connections to other things in your lived experience. And this gets back to a lecture that I gave in a previous class when I was talking about this pouring vessel and how it related to the Notre Dame du Haut, this chapel with the pointy roof and box canyons and things like that. And so kind of what I've been interested in is trying to develop a way of talking about the relationship between the functional form of pots especially, and this way in which the details of those functional forms can invoke broader sorts of ideas and give it a different layer of meaning to ceramics. So let me just jump into some examples of that. I don't know how recently many of you have taken an English course, let's say, but you probably somewhere before have come across the terms synecdoche and metonymy. And let me just refer back to my notes to make sure that I don't get any of these definitions wrong. So according to Wikipedia, a synecdoche is a figure of speech in which a term for a part of something is used to refer to the whole of it, or vice versa. So for example, an often used synecdoche is to refer to boots on the ground, to refer to soldiers. On the other hand, metonymy is a figure of speech in which a thing or a concept is referred to by the name of something closely associated with that thing or concept. And in literary theory, and especially in looking at poetry, metonymy often takes a more specific meaning of using tangible or concrete things to invoke or represent intangible things. So for example, when you want to refer to feelings in a kind of abstract sense, you might instead refer concretely to the heart as a material organ in the human body. And so, when we look at some historic ceramics, it's very easy to see examples of similar sorts of things going on here. So on the left-hand side, we have an image of a Bellarmine jug, also known as a Bartman jug, where there's a funny story here of, these were jugs that were made, and this is going back to the 17th century. These are jugs that were made that generally would be used to hold beer, to store beer. But they would have often this imprinted image of a kind of an older man's face. And this was the image of some bishop or something like that who was strongly associated with a kind of prohibition that was happening at the time. So it's meant to be a kind of an ironic gesture to have a picture of this particular person's face who is anti-alcohol, but to put that then on vessels that were very specifically meant for the storage of beer. And so here you see that this kind of face, which is often very, what's the right word? I mean, not very detailed, right? But still, given the history of what was going on at the time, people at that time would have understood exactly what that was referring to and the irony that it brought with it. And so here's an example of something that's sort of like, to me, it's sort of like a synecdoche in this ceramic piece. Another example we have in the middle here, this tea bowl, the particular style is Shino. And this is a kind of piece that was made in the 16th century in Japan during the Momoyama period. And so if you look at this piece, like all of this white pinhole-y kind of stuff, that's a glaze that's been applied to this pot. But there's a very small round region right here where there's no glaze that was applied. And so you see down to the bare clay. This is a very intentional thing that was often done with glazed ceramics, where the way that that comes about is you can imagine that if you have the, so I might have made this tea bowl, allowed it to dry so that it became stiff, that you could handle it without breaking it if you were careful. And glaze is something that you apply. The glaze is liquid. I mean, you can kind of vaguely think of it as being like a paint when you're applying it. But if you imagine taking this tea bowl and grabbing it from underneath, so that maybe your thumb would be sitting here held tight against the clay. And so you would hold it, gripping it tightly with your thumb really pressed against the clay like that, and then dunk the tea bowl down into a vat of glaze. And then you would hold it up, let the excess glaze run off and dry. And so then this would be the thing that you would then fire. But then when you let go of it, there would actually be a little empty spot in the glaze where your thumb had just been covering the clay. And so these sorts of marks, which have a name in Japanese, they're called yubiato. They're sort of like the fingerprints of the person who made them. And so I think that's another nice example of synecdoche, where you have just something which is a fingerprint of the maker, but it's a kind of reminder or invokes the presence of the maker in the outward visual appearance of a bowl like this. And then, you know, on the metonymy side, so we talked about things like this last week. This image, I showed this in the Material Agency talk. But so here's an example of an even older piece from Japan, which was clearly wood-fired. Looking at this, it looks like this jar was probably laying on its side. So this side would have been down the way that it was stacked on its kiln. And it looks like wood was being stoked actually on top of this piece, so that the wood would kind of land here, burn, melt, and then the ash would eventually drip down the sides. But then you have this remnant kind of surface decoration of the melted and running ash, which, at least if you know something about the process by which these sorts of pots are fired, it really invokes or recalls the idea that, you know, this pot has been through extreme heat. It has survived a kind of purgatory, right? Or it has been kind of cleansed by fire in some way. It's been to the edge of destruction and back. And so these sorts of surface markings that you will sometimes get in wood firing, they have a metonymy kind of purpose in something very tangible, right? These ash strips that are left on the surface of the pot, referencing an idea of like ordeal or survival or something like that in the way that this piece was actually created. So another thing that I've been very interested in, so Anthony Easthope, in a famous book called Poetry as Discourse, actually refers back to an earlier essay by W.K. Wimsatt. But I think Easthope's little passage explains this idea more clearly than if you go back to the original Wimsatt essay. So Easthope writes, in an essay on rhyme and reason, W.K. Wimsatt has analyzed the way rhyme in poetry is either subordinated to meaning or made coincident with it. He contrasts the rhymes of Pope and Chaucer. Rhyme leads the reader to expect some further similarity between the words which sound the same. In fact, Pope's couplets tend to rhyme words which are different parts of speech. For example, eyes and rise, and or syllable length, so laws and applause. We anticipate similarity and find difference, right? There's similarity in the sound, but difference either in the grammatical role of the word or in its length. And so Wimsatt claims that such rhyming between different parts of speech, let's say, works to throw a stress upon the meaning so that the meaning dominates the sound and the rhyme is subordinated, right? So the sound rhyme calls attention to that pair of words, but since the pair of words have this different function as parts of speech, what you actually end up calling to attention to is the meanings of those words. And Wimsatt says, the more exact the rhyme, the greater this effect. Typical rhymes from Chaucer, by contrast, are called tame by Wimsatt because the same parts of speech are used in closely parallel functions. Relative to subordination, coincidence in rhyme emphasizes the phonetic. right? So where you have rhymes at the ends of lines that are between the same parts of speech, two nouns or two verbs or whatever, there's not that difference in part of speech to kind of refocus your attention on the meaning. So what you end up doing is you end up emphasizing the sound. So I think there's a very interesting analog to that when you're looking at POTS, where instead of parts of speech, I'll talk about sort of parts of form or formal components or something like that. So just to give an example, like I think we can all imagine or have come across the idea of visual rhyme, right? So visual structures or patterns that recall one another. And so here on the left we have a famous kind of bowl by a ceramist named Richard Devore. And on the right-hand side, I'm not actually sure what this thing is meant to be. It's just called cone, but it's by, again, a well-known Japanese ceramist named Fukami Haru. And so if we look at this piece here, right, the overall top rim of this bowl has this kind of teardrop shape, which is echoed again here in a cutout in what's actually sort of a false bottom to the bowl. Right, so the real bottom of the bowl is down there. It has a false bottom with this sort of little cutout, but we see this repetition of the teardrop shape. But I think that, because both of them appear on what are the rims of different regions, mostly what I think this repetition serves to do is to emphasize the teardrop shape. Similarly, on the cone over here, you see that the overall form of this thing is a cone, but then like there's a celadon glaze here which sort of ends, and there's another little region down here which is left as bare porcelain. And so you get a repetition of that cone shape down there. But since these are both, instances of the cone that relate to the overall outline of the piece, I think the function there of repeating the overall cone and this kind of inset cone, the function of that is to kind of emphasize the coniness of the overall piece. So we could contrast that with the two pieces that are on this slide here. So on the left, we have a round vase or a jar by Tsujimura Shiro, who's come up in many of our recent lectures. And so here, this is another wood-fired piece. And if you know something about how these things are made, you would recognize that it's bare clay that was put into a wood-burning kiln. So it acquired these orangey brown sorts of hues just from the interaction of the kiln atmosphere with the clay. And there are some also regions that took on a greenish sort of glassy surface quality, which is due to ash having melted on those areas and kind of fused into a sort of a glaze. But then what's going on with this region down here? The way that these things are made is that the potter would have taken another cup or a bowl or something like that and basically stuck it to the side of the larger vase, right? So that the area that you see here as kind of a relatively plain circle would have been covered up by this other cup or bowl that was actually attached to the surface of the vase. And they would have been fired that way. And you can kind of see how ash may be accumulated at this ridge that gets created where the bowl attaches to the surface of the vase. So there's a kind of accumulated of melted ash there. But then after the firing, that bowl that was there gets knocked off. And often you'll have to actually kind of break them off so that you leave a little bit of a jagged rim that's behind there. So where are the visual rhymes in this piece? I mean, you have the overall roundness of the whole pot. You have the roundness of this rim. And then I think most importantly, you have an echo of that roundness in this round mark here. But to the extent that you know something about the way that these are made, to me, that has a very strong kind of impact there where you know that this is a vessel, this vessel has a mouth. There was another vessel that had its own mouth that was kind of attached by suction onto this original piece. But what you see in that round mark there is sort of, it's the absence of that other vessel, right? So in a way, if you think about vessels as people, to me, this kind of visual rhyme really emphasizes something about a missing other. Likewise here in this really amazing earthenware piece from the region that is now Peru, so this is attributed to the Moche civilization a few hundred years BCE. It's a pouring vessel, I believe, right? So this is actually what would be a spout. These sorts of so-called stirrup spouts are very common in South American earthenware. But what I love about this piece is you've got this roundness in the stirrup spout, and then this roundness in what looks like the cresting of a wave. And so they're in very different parts of speech of the piece, so to speak. So there's this roundness here, which is in something that's related to the spout. This roundness here, which you can imagine might actually be the handle by which you would pick this thing up and tilt it to pour. There's this overall reference to the shape of a breaking wave. But since these two things are, they recall each other, but they are sort of falling in opposite directions. Like I really like that about this piece, that it it sets up a very dynamic sort of tension, right? So obviously the piece is in equilibrium, like it's not going to fall over on its own. On the other hand, you really have this strong sense of the wave breaking to the right, but this stirrup falling to the left. And so that visual rhyme in these very different aspects of the piece, to me, set up a really dynamic sort of tension in the piece that really gives it a lot of energy in its form. To introduce a related term, which is hard to pronounce, I think you're supposed to say this antinaclasis. And a famous example of antinaclasis is the following quote that says, "We must indeed all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately." This is a quote often attributed to Benjamin Franklin, although apparently there's quite a bit of doubt about that. If we, again, look at Wikipedia for a definition of the term, Wikipedia says that antinaclasis is the stylistic scheme of repeating a single word or phrase, but with a different meaning, often found in slogans. So on a bit of a linguistic digression, I found what I thought were some really interesting examples of this. So in the Atlantic magazine in July of 2017, there's an article written by a journalist named Elaine Godfrey. And so she just presents this article, question of the week, what would your slogan be? And so this was apparently something about trying to come up with a new political slogan for the Democratic Party. I'm not sure in some specific area. But in this article, Godfrey says, on Monday, Democrats unveiled a new agenda, quote, a better deal, better jobs, better wages, better future. And this new agenda that they hope will help them reclaim a majority in Congress, et cetera, et cetera. She later writes, Americans on both sides of the aisle are, quote, tired of politicians helping their millionaire and billionaire buddies get richer. This is, I guess, something that was written by Adam H. from California, somebody who had responded to this question of the week, what would your slogan be? So Adam H. offers that perhaps the best slogan would be working for the working class. Something Adam says reflects what all Americans want, someone who is on their side fighting for them. So I thought this was a really interesting example of both this Wimsat East Hope kind of idea of rhymes in different parts of speech, but here it's even stronger than rhyme, right? It's the repetition of a word. So in this first version of the slogan, that's a better deal, better jobs, better wages, better future. It's almost like after you've read or heard that, you don't even remember what the slogan was, you just remember better, 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 better. On the other hand, in the slogan that's offered by one of the readers responding to this article in The Atlantic, the slogan, working for the working class, there you have working appearing in two different senses, and I think that helps to emphasize more the meaning of the slogan, right? This someone who is on your side fighting for you. So if we look at that in the context of some ceramic pieces, a first example, well, let me start with this one. So in this Chinese porcelain piece, there's this sort of bell shape here, which is repeated again, I think, quite strongly in the bottom. But I think, since they're, so it's repeated, and I think it's, since they're at least slightly different, I do think that that repetition serves to unify the overall form of the piece. But someplace where it's maybe not working so well is in this candle over here, where you have this sort of tabular, almost cartouche sort of shape, which appears in the decoration in the top. It appears again in the decorations on the bottom. But then it's, again, sort of repeated in the overall form of this drop lip, and then also in the forms that are created by the presence of this separating band on the neck. And so to me, like, I would almost say that this piece is a little bit like the better, 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 better slogan, where kind of the thing that you notice most about it is the presence of that shape as a constituent form. But there's too much of it, and I think not without enough formal variation, so that I don't know that it really lends any particular overall coherence to the piece. Here, I think you're a little bit better off, but maybe the best example is this one over here, another Peruvian piece, this time from the Chavin civilization. And so what you have is another stirrup handle pouring vessel, but the form that I see repeated is this sort of almost trapezoidal sort of form, which to me then is repeated in this this cat that's sort of coiled up and ready to jump. And so obviously we have two very different uses of that form, setting up here in the stirrup handle and down here in this applied decoration. But to where you associate that sort of form of this hunched cat as something that contains a lot of coiled up energy waiting to spring, I think that really repeating that up here really helps to give the entire piece that sort of feeling like it's about to jump up off the surface. And so for what would otherwise be a relatively heavy form, like if you look at this form, all of the visual weight is really down at the bottom. But I really do think that on the whole, repeating this sort of form down here and up there, and kind of carrying this association of the coiled up energy ready to jump and moving it up here, up to the pot again, it helps to give the entire piece a little bit more lift and prevents it from feeling like it's a little bit too bottom heavy. Moving on to something a little bit more complicated. I don't know how many of you would have come across Roland Barthes' essay, Rhetoric of the Image, in other classes. But so there's again, a well-known passage in this particular essay that's describing an advertisement for a kind of pasta products company. So I'll just read a little excerpt from that essay. Barthes writes, in the Panzani advertisement, the Mediterranean vegetables, the color, the composition, the very profusion rise up as so many scattered blocks, at once isolated and mounted in a general scene which has its own space and, as was seen, its meaning. They are set in a syntagm which is not theirs and which is that of the denotation. We can now understand that it is precisely the syntagm of the denoted message which naturalizes the system of the connoted message. So a lot of jargon in there, but kind of what's meant is, if you look at this advertisement and just kind of take it in as a whole, it's clear what the suggestion is, right? There's a market bag, like you've just gone to the farmer's market. And so you see some typical things in there that you would associate with a farmer's market. So fresh tomatoes, fresh mushrooms, onions. But then kind of along in there, kind of innocently going on along for the ride, are prepackaged things like dried pasta, canned tomato sauce, and I don't know what this is. Maybe it's cheese or something like that. But by setting all of these things into this naturalistic looking farmer's market kind of scene, they're trying to slip in the idea that these vegetables are things that you think of as fresh, natural products, and these packaged things from the Panzani company are exactly the same, right? That's what they're trying to get across to you in this advertisement. And so there's a way in which things that don't necessarily go together are presented in an overall grammar or an overall structure which asserts or even fools you into thinking that they do naturally go together. And the overall effect is to try to build for you an association that you might not otherwise make on your own. And that's kind of the point of this advertisement, right? Is they're trying to convince you that the Panzani pasta products are just as good as going to the farmer's market yourself. And so I think, you again have interesting examples of this occurring in the world of ceramics. So we saw some cups like this. This is one of the cups by Aaron Toole that we saw in one of the videos in one of the afternoon sessions, where he takes images of war that come from imprints that he makes from toys or other things like that, and he puts them on the surfaces of these cups. And so here we have something where these symbols are assembled in the syntagm or the functional kind of structure of a cup. And it has this naturalizing effect in the sense that you maybe don't think about them too much, but you kind of, it's a way that you grab these things, and because of the functional role of the cup, you bring them into yourself and you have a much more intimate contact with these symbols than maybe you ever ordinarily would have. And maybe the first dozen times you use the cup, you don't even really think too much about what these things are. But as Aaron Toole says in that video, kind of his aim is, or his hope is, that these things will eventually spark some conversation, as he says, between people who know what these things are and people who don't. Or another striking example can be found in the work of Richard Notkin. And so he had a famous series of teapots that he did like this that were meant to be kind of commentaries on the dangers of nuclear holocaust. And so you have things like a mushroom cloud that's serving as the handle for the lid of this teapot, this giant ear, which I think is a reference to some particular president, serving as the handle, these barrels of toxic waste that form the spout, the skull, which is the body of the teapot, and these dice, which I think are meant to be something about, gambling with the fate of humanity in promoting nuclear stockpiling and the arms race. And so a lot of these things are not necessarily things that you would associate coming together, but presenting them all within the syntagm, the structure of a teapot, is a kind of, that provides you with a way to put these things next to each other, and in the end, try to get you to associate all these things in ways that you maybe otherwise wouldn't. Almost to the end here. So one other fancy trope word that I learned when I was putting together this lecture, the term metalepsis. So again, if you look at Wikipedia for a definition, metalepsis is a figure of speech in which a word or a phrase from figurative speech is used in a new context. For example, I've got to catch the worm tomorrow. So that's something where the worm reference originally comes from early bird catches the worm. So it's something about being early. And so if you say something using that in a new context, like I've got to catch the worm tomorrow, what you're trying to say is that I have to get up early tomorrow, but you've borrowed something from one figure of speech and you've kind of you're using it in a new context. So a couple of examples of that, we looked, I think, at some point when we talked briefly about Jomon earthenware in ancient Japan, about these cord wrap markings. And so this chevron or herringbone sort of pattern that appears on the outside of this bowl. And this bowl is, by the way, a contemporary piece made around 1975. So these were made by wrapping a cord around a stick and then kind of rolling that to make imprints on the surface of this bowl while it was still soft. And so that kind of cord marking appears on Jomon pottery of some indigenous people of the what is now Japan, 10,000 years ago and more. And so it definitely has a sort of a localization to those particular Japanese people. But then the way that this particular bowl was finished was that the imprint was not left bare, right? So there's not actually indents in the clay when this piece is finished, but rather the indented regions of the surface were filled in with a white slip that contrasts with the dark color of the bare clay. So in the end, you have a kind of color contrast that's that herringbone pattern rather than actual herringbone indentations. But that technique of the white slip inlay, this is something that we much more strongly associate with kind of classical Korean pottery. And so this particular fellow, Shimaoka Tatsuzo, he was a very well-known Japanese potter who popularized this particular technique. But here it's something where you take manners of surface decoration that have their very own strongly associated idioms. So ancient Jomon pottery on the one hand, or classical Korean pottery on the other, and tries to combine them to create something new, which is both new and not new. But I think it's at least, for someone who's fluent or conversant in the kind of history of East Asian pottery, you can see exactly what's going on when you're looking at a piece like this. Perhaps an even better example is provided by these vases over here, which maybe have the look of a Chinese polychrome overglaze ceramics, but these were actually made in Germany in the Meissen factory in 1733. We alluded at the beginning of the quarter to this very long history of how porcelain was apparently first brought from China to Western Europe by Marco Polo, and this set off many centuries of monarchies trying to reproduce porcelain in Western Europe. But here, when you look at the particular manner of painting, these are clearly borrowed from Chinese ceramics of earlier times. And in the original Chinese context, these various things that appear in the painting, so the specific types of flowers, and I would imagine the specific types of birds that are there, they have very strong conventional symbolic associations. So according to a book that I found, chrysanthemums in this sort of Chinese decoration symbolize both autumn and longevity. Peonies are associated with royalty and virtue, and so on and so forth. But if you think about these things as now not images that were painted by Chinese artists on a vase made in China, but rather these were painted by German artists on German reproductions of Chinese porcelain, kind of after Chinese porcelain started to become really appreciated in Europe and they wanted to make some domestically. I think it's clear that what they really do in that context is they basically just represent Chineseness, right? So it's a form of metalepsis there where the reference is kind of once removed. And so lastly, again, leading into something that we'll see more in the afternoon session, I wanted to talk a little bit about intertextuality and something called the anxiety of influence. So Harold Bloom, who just passed away very recently, was a kind of controversial, but I would say very well-known literary critic. And he had some really extreme views. Maybe the best way to sum them up are with this quote at the bottom, where he says in one of his books, and he's kind of talking about the way that poets especially are influenced by reading the works of earlier poets. And so Bloom says, influence, as I conceive it, means that there are no texts, but only relationships between texts. And that relates to quotes like these other ones above. The later poet, so that means like a poet born in the 17th or 18th century or later, right? So Bloom says, the later poet holds his own poem so open again to the precursor's work, so the influence of poets that he or she has read that came before, so open again to the precursor's work that at first we might believe the wheel has come full circle and that we are back in the later poet's flooded apprenticeship before his strength began to assert itself in the revisionary ratios. But the poem is now held open to the precursor where once it was open, and the uncanny effect is that the new poem's achievement makes it seem to us as though the later poet himself had written the precursor's characteristic work. Actually, let me come back to explaining that a little bit in comparison to this other quote. Bloom says Milton, the poet Milton, with all his strength, yet had to struggle subtly and crucially with a major precursor in Spenser, and this struggle both formed and malformed Milton. So what's going on in these pair of quotes is Bloom has this kind of theory of the development of poets that, as a young person growing up, you read somebody else's poetry, right? So some poet that's come before, you read their work, and this is, you fall in love with it, and this is kind of your inspiration to want to be a poet yourself. But then as you develop as a poet, it is so hard for you to overcome that initial influence that kind of, no matter what you do, kind of what you end up doing is trying to write that prior poet's poetry. And that those kinds of influences are so strong that even for somebody like Milton, who was a great poet in his own right, really had to work in order for the poetry that he wrote to not just be a revision of Spenser or a kind of revisiting of Spenser. And in fact, that struggle to not copy becomes so strong that it kind of deforms the work that Milton himself wrote. And you can agree with that or not, but it's a very interesting kind of assertion of the way that an art form evolves over time and the role of the influence of early work on later work. And I think what he's trying to say in this this first quote here is something like, the best that you can hope to do, really, if you are a person coming into an art form late after when it was originally created, was you can make the work that you make can seem so fresh and new that even for somebody who's familiar with the earlier kinds of work that inspired you, that when they look at your work, your work somehow revisits in a way that kind of almost reinvents it, so that you can almost imagine that the newer poet's work was the original and that the original inspirations were copies of it. So I think it's really interesting to consider this in the context of ceramics, because ceramics is an art form with an incredibly long history, as we've discussed, right? So we have existing examples of pottery going back 10,000 years, at least some scattered examples. And then especially in certain kinds of poetry, like lately in this class, we've been focusing on wood-fired pottery. Certainly, I think a lot of people in the West who nowadays are engaged in making wood-fired ceramics, the original inspiration of that, right? The original things that we see in a museum that make us really interested in this particular way of making pots, that's wood-fired ceramics from the medieval period in Japan. And so a great example of it is this particular kind of form. We've seen it in a few different contexts, like in the tea ceremony video from last week, or in some of the discussion on materiality and wabi-sabi. So this is a container for water. It has a little bit of a lid. But then, there are many beautiful surviving examples of water jars like this from the 1500s, 1600s in Japan that have these subtly deformed shapes and this very organic, natural surface finish from the wood firing. And they have a certain form and size. And seeing things like this is what draws a lot of us into really appreciating the beauty of that kind of ceramics and wanting to do that kind of thing ourselves. And so you spend a lot of time learning how to do that, but then eventually you realize that, oh, but really kind of what you're trying to do, effectively what you end up doing is trying to copy the aesthetics of this work from hundreds of years ago. And you then eventually feel the need to try to do something different. And this is where Bloom comes in, where Bloom says things like, well, often what then ends up happening is that the artist will turn to some kind of trope as a kind of a defense mechanism, right? They'll grab a trope of some kind, apply it to their work, and say that, see here is why my work is different from that of my precursors. And so you can see some interesting examples of that in these two pieces, where here's a cover jar by Robert Turner. who I mentioned in talking about Canyon de Chez in that whole lecture on metaphor. But here's a cover jar from the mid-90s. The first thing to note about it is that it's huge, right? So this guy down here is 8 inches in diameter, and the height is 15, is 7, so sorry. So the height is about 7 inches, and the diameter is about 8 inches. Here's another jar that can't help but reference, the classic medieval water jars. This thing is now 16 inches in height and 13 inches wide, so it's really much bigger. So you have a kind of resort to hyperbole. And, again, we also saw that last week in the afternoon in the Don Wright's T-Bowl, which is really way oversized. But you can resort to hyperbole as a defense mechanism against the accusation or the fear that you're just recreating previous work that inspired you. And then there's also in this piece a form of metalepsis. In this, what for the form, it seems like a rather unusual way of making a handle on the lid of this covered jar. You can actually recognize this if you go back, for instance, in some of the videos about the African potters, that this is actually a fairly common sort of top handle sort of finish for jars in the African ceramics context. So there, I'm sure that it has some symbolic reference in that context. But Turner, who spent a lot of time studying the art of African art, and it was a great inspiration to him, he borrows that as a way of making what's effectively now a handle for a covered jar like this. Or if we look at this Don Wright's piece, which in a similar way to that T-bowl that we talked about last week in the afternoon, is super oversized, right? So this is also 18.5 inches tall by 17 inches in diameter. So there's the hyperbole there, and this is a 2012 piece. But then you then also see that, the seeds of the feeling of roughness or casualness of form, little things that seem a little bit unfinished, but kind of in a materialistic or wabi-sabi kind of fashion, if you will, on the original inspirations, they get super amplified in some of Don Wright's later work, so that, this entire jar is just made up of sheets of clay that were kind of torn and then pushed back together. The entire lid is just a bunch of like torn slabs of clay that have kind of been stacked up to make a lid. The handle is a very loosely made thing. The surface textures are really very rough, and again, it's wood fired. But so you could again see that as a form of extreme hyperbole, as a sort of defense mechanism to say, yes, I am making covered jars because they are such a classic form of the genre, but I'm not merely copying the inspiration that I have from medieval Japanese ceramics, let's say, because of these ways in which I've changed the form. And depending on whether you like these pieces or not, you might think that these then become very interesting sculptural pieces in their own right. I happen to really like them. But you could complain, on the other hand, that these forms are really distorted in a way by this need to distinguish themselves from just being reproductions of earlier artwork.